Okay, welcome to Money Night here at Nuts and Bolts of New Ventures. The first part of the evening, we'll have a panel talking about financing sources. And the second part will be a presentation on financial projections, how you're going to put things together to help those financing sources figure out who you are. So I'm going to start off with a little video from the Kauffman Foundation on where money comes from.
Which may or may not come as a big surprise, but they do. The number one source they get money from is from their own savings, whether it's a few $100 or even thousands of dollars. That's what we tend to tap first. Now, a lot of companies don't get money from any other place. They get money from their own savings, and then after that, they're lucky enough to be cash flow positive. They're profitable. So we talk a lot as if all companies require all sorts of extra capital. The reality is that more than half of their companies get all their funding from a combination of founder savings and then cash flow from the business, and we're out of here. Next up on the list is another one that catches people by surprise, and that's credit cards. Almost every young company you can think of, to one degree or another, was funded on credit card. And it is the single largest source of capital for young companies after founder savings. And then the next place where they tend to get money is from friends and family. After I've tapped out my credit card and I've used up all my savings, I turn to people I know and say, hey, will you help me? And that's the third biggest source of capital. And then the next place is banks. And the banks are a totally weird situation because with banks, they get a lot of attention, but they actually fund very, very few young companies. But it's not their fault. You have to think about the way bank lending works and how shareholders want banks to lend. They want them to lend money against secured assets. And young companies don't have any security. They have nothing to secure it against. And the joke in the industry is that you can get all the bank funding you want as a startup as long as you don't need it. And then the last, they get the lion's share of the attention, which in some ways is warranted. You know, your Googles and Apples and FedExes and many others all have venture capital money inside of them. But the reality is, and this is from Kauffman research, less than 20% of the fastest growing companies in the United States took any venture. And that's not because the VCs wouldn't give it to them, it's because they didn't want it, they didn't need it, because they had all those other sources. I don't need money, and I certainly don't need money on these terms. Because venture capitalists, unlike banks, they don't lend against secured assets. They give you money in exchange for shares. So they take some of your company away. So my answer is, if you don't need it, definitely don't get it. There's no question the venture industry has become steady. The irony is it's intended to fund disruption, and yet it's an industry that has become complacent. And interestingly, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen the emergence of other mechanisms for funding, like AngelList, like these kinds of peer-to-peer funding sources, as people increasingly provide capital in smaller amounts, but more people doing it directly. Having said all of that, though, venture capitalists are hugely important for those young companies that don't have access to bank money, but are growth companies. They have the prospect of being a $5 million or a $10 million company in a couple of years, and they need that growth capital to get there quickly. So it's a race. And the way you play the race is by getting money from people like venture capitalists who give you the money so you can compete with other people who are racing as fast as you are. If you can run a company off cash flow and some combination of credit card, your own savings, and friends and family, run. Keep all the equity, because there's no better thing than full control of your own destiny.
So I think I'll just leave that up there. So to tell us more about what's not covered in that video and other sources of financing, we have a panel that was assembled tonight by Julianne Zimmerman, and maybe we can have the panel come up. And while they're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about Julianne. I've known her for a bunch of years, and she's a person of many accomplishments. She's been an entrepreneur, engineering entrepreneur. She's been a venture capitalist. She's now doing public impact investing. And a little known fact is she was a candidate for the astronaut program. She was a candidate to be an astronaut. Wow. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julianne. Do you want? You're all set.
I'm on the level here. Clearly Steve will be providing the comedy relief this evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here for this session. We are going to try to demystify this topic a little bit. And one of the things I'm just going to tell you right up front is that if you are expecting to have a little tutorial in how to meet VCs, this is not what you're going to get here. We are going to talk about how to think about the capital needs for your enterprise, both in terms of the variety of kinds of capital and also in terms of the needs over time. And that's a lot to cover in a short span, so we're going to try to do it conversationally. We will provide time for questions, but I encourage you, if we say something that's jargon that you don't understand, or if we say something that just doesn't seem to make sense to you, please let us know that in real time so we can make those corrections. Yeah, fair? Okay, so we're going to introduce the panel in just a moment. As Joe said, I've been in this field in a variety of incarnations since really before we had the lingo and the cultural trend around entrepreneurship, innovation, disruption, blah, blah, blah. People have been entrepreneurs for centuries, but we didn't really have this sort of cultural phenomenon until quite recently. And it continues to evolve. It's not a static thing. So the options, the flavors, the opportunities, the pros and cons continue to shift and develop over time. So you as founders have both the privilege and the burden of really thinking about what are the most appropriate forms of capital for your enterprise specifically. With that in mind, just to give us a little bit of flavor, and apologies for those of you on Zoom, because I don't have Zoom poll capability. For those of you in the room, how many have already raised any kind of capital whatsoever? Grant funds, friends and family? Okay, pretty good fraction. How many of you are currently raising now or preparing to raise now? Okay, also. And how many of you are thinking of this as more of like a future consideration? You're not quite ready. Yeah, okay, so panel, you see the breakdown? Excuse me. For the benefit of both the people in the room and the people on Zoom, so please do use the microphones. Please introduce yourselves and specifically give us the context of your knowledge in this particular context, because all of you are fantastic people who have done very many things. We're going to stick to the topic of capital first for young growing companies, okay? Kerry, please, would you lead us off?
Yes, good evening. Happy to be here. My name is Kerry Bowie. I'm class of 94 environmental engineering and class of 06 MBA. Background in environmental engineering, like I said, worked in state government, started a consulting practice, run a couple of nonprofits, and recently launched a venture capital fund. And so I've done work in this space, one on the accelerator side. So gotten to work with hundreds of companies through the Majura project, which we do at the Boston Consulting Group. I'm also a core instructor with the National Science Foundation's Innovation Core program. So I get to see a lot of startups through that. I do that through MIT's New England Regional Innovation Node. I sit on the investment committee of the Boston Ujima project. And so that's not venture capital, but, as we're talking about different types of capital, sort of revenue-based financing and, sort of integrated capital stack types of products, I've done some of that work. And like I said, lastly, just launched a venture capital fund called Malika Ventures, which is targeted at Black and Brown founders or people serving underserved communities in the climate tech space. So is that enough?
Multiple perspectives, yes. Thank you, Priya.
Yeah, hi everyone, Priya Yadav, and my background is in computer engineering. I was a senior director of engineering at Intel for a very long time, And several years ago, I decided to foray into this world, venture capital. And so I'm an investor at Mass Ventures. And for your information, Mass Ventures is one of the oldest VC firms. We were founded 45 years ago, and we're still alive and kicking. And we focus on deep tech. So deep tech could be, advanced manufacturing, automation, robotics, clean tech, life sciences, you name it, right? It's deep tech. And we've been investing, basically, we look at investing across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So you're a Massachusetts-based startup, you come to us, and we invest at the seed stage. So if you're a seed stage startup, then reach out to us, and we invest all the way up to Series A. The other thing I'll say is that we're a little unique. We also offer grants. So we give 67 grants a year in all different ranges, right, of capital. And this is non-dilutive. And essentially, you don't need to get a grant to get funding from us, but it helps, right? The grantees are also our pipeline. So I think I'll just leave it at that and turn it over to Steve.
Thank you. Good to hear about Mass Ventures. I'm Steve Derezinski. I am a course 2 undergrad from here, and I remember sneaking in the back way up there a long time ago. I'm not gonna give dates, even though Kerry let us off. I'm older than Kerry. I also have an MBA from Sloan in the Sloan Fellows Program, so kind of mirroring those two worlds of engineer MBA is where I find my sweet spot. As it relates to fundraising, years ago, I was down at Georgia Tech and they wanted somebody to launch their faculty incubator. And it was one of those situations where everybody was looking around and sort of looking at the ground. And of course, the crazy one was going, "Oh, pick me, I totally want to run a faculty incubator." So I launched Georgia Tech's Venture Lab program, which is focused on creating technology companies and spinning them out, or starting with technologies in the university and then spinning them out into venture-backed companies. So you can imagine being in Atlanta with a bunch of technologies, and then how do we get attention from venture capitalists? So luckily, we formed a program, and I have a lot of experience taking kind of early stage technologies, trying to de-risk them and trying to push them out to the marketplace, all the while interfacing with the venture community. And it says up there that I'm a serial entrepreneur. I actually look at it more like a parallel entrepreneur. And I'm now running a co-foundry in Kendall Square where we're doing lots of these at the same time. Also, I think some of you, one of you is in my SBIR class. So 2 of you are in my SBIR class. I taught teaching an SBIR class yesterday, and tomorrow is the advanced versions on how to win SBIR fundings. I've done about $23 million with the federal contracting that way, and I've also personally raised, I don't know, like $20 million or something for all the different ventures I've been involved with. So any of those questions that you want to ask, and it's great because now you see like SBIR and then Mass Ventures and then Kerry. I think that's why we're set up this way. So early stage to later stage. Is that enough, or do you want more?
No, that's great. By the way, I think you know that the speaker bios are on the Nuts and Bolts course website, and there's a lot more you can garner about each of us. But this session is really not about our bios, and I want us to dive right in. First of all, does everybody know what non-dilutive means? Most of you. So non-dilutive just means that it doesn't cost you ownership. That's what it means. So any kind of angel or venture investment costs you some fraction of your company, right? It may not cost that fraction right up front. It may be postponed to a later date in the form of a convertible note, but it costs you some part of your company. Non-dilutive just means that you repay that money in some other way. In the form of a grant. Usually you're repaying it in the form of reports and data and assuring the grant makers that they have made a good decision so that they can go back to their powers that be and say, look what we're accomplishing with this money. In the case of loans, obviously you're repaying the capital plus some service interest on that loan. Every kind of capital costs you something. So let's start off, if you don't mind. For those who are starting, let's do another quick hand poll. Sorry again, for those of you on Zoom. Who is pre-launch, pre-commercial? Quite a few of you. Who is entering the marketplace now? None. Who already is in market? One? Okay, so for most of us in the room, we're getting ready to launch. So as we're getting ready to launch, what are the questions as founders we should be asking ourselves about our capital needs and the options to address those capital needs? Mr. Faculty Accelerator, you want to start?
I go first?
You can go first.
Okay. So I think, you know, obviously the cash needs to get to break even is probably the most important thing, but you know, how that actually works out in your business is specific to your business model and specific, but that's probably the number one question you'll get asked. Probably not in the beginning. After you've gone through your pitch and after your conversation, it'll be like, oh, and I'm actually going to give a talk on this after this, so I don't want to give away too much of that, but should I toss it over, or
Give yourself a little
Okay.
tee up and then pass it along.
So the other question is going to be, what is your business model? And what I find is when I'm pitching investors and describing the business, a lot of times they ask the question, what is your business model? And I honestly, after doing this for so many years, I really think that translates to, I don't really understand what you just described to me. I want to know how you're going to make money. And can you just break it down into really simple terms so I can understand what your business is? So, you know, that's kind of the perspective from the investor side. And I just wanted to mention that because I think it's important for you to realize that when some people ask that question, they may not be being impolite. They just don't really understand what you're getting at. And to bring it down into sort of basic terms is very helpful. So I'll stop there.
Perfect. And so even if you're applying for a grant, Priya, people also, founders need to be able to think about their capital needs and how they're going to get to a point where they are no longer dependent on outside capital. So how does that, how should founders be thinking about that when they're approaching a grant maker?
So whether you're doing, approaching a VC or writing a grant, you have to be a good storyteller. That's what I tell everyone. So think through, it's like a pitch competition. A grant writing is nothing more than that. That's the way you're communicating your story to somebody who's reading your application, say, for example. So we tell everybody who applies for our grants, right? Think of it as a pitch competition. So tell your story in a very clear way. Don't be too technology focused. Like if you're looking to get money, that means we want to see more of the business side as well. So think about not just your problem, solution, secret sauce. Have you done enough research into what else is out there in terms of your competition, your market, right? How you're going to make money? Just have you raised any money so far? What have you done, right? We just want to see all of that. And so just tell us a good story. And so that, when we see our application, we know that you've thought through everything, whether you're going to raise capital, right? Venture or not. It's the same thesis is how I see it.
Yeah. So Kerry, you do through Manjira Project, you do a lot of work with founders who are just figuring this out. They're just figuring out what are my capital needs and what might my revenue model look like, and how do I prioritize the kinds of capital I should pursue? So what are some particularly useful ways that founders can boil down that huge set of questions to something that feels manageable?
Yeah, and I think keep this as simple as possible. It all boils down, especially really early before you're getting, like the Kaufman video, before you're selling something and getting, money generating revenue. It boils down to really cash flow. How much money do you have, and, tying that to, burn rate. So, and what does that mean? What do you need to get to that launch to do your, is it your minimal viable product? Do you have a prototype? Do you need to, have, a different level of sales team? It depends on what you're doing. So you need to sort of map that out and go, how much money are you plowing through sort of every month? And then, how much runway, so burn rate and runway, how much runway do you need to launch? And really sort of focusing on that piece and figuring out what's the best way to do that. And so, Steve was talking about, if you're in a space where you can get some grant, funding, you can get some SBIR or STTR or something, going back to what Julianne said about, non-dilutive is best, as long as you can do it, until you are in a race. When you're in a race and you need to pour, gasoline on the fire, then you go and get, the VC funding. And I think the bridge in between that is, the angel investors. They're going to take some, but, I think they're sort of kinder, gentler versions of VCs. They tend to, be a little bit more personally vested in helping out in a different way. And sometimes I don't say they don't want their money back. They do, but sometimes it's also other things that are bringing them in. And so you can maybe get some, slightly better terms there. So I think that's what we typically, try to do, very early on, helping people to get connected to people who are, really interested in what they're doing, and really trying to help them to go, like we said at the beginning of the video, if you don't have to take, money, especially from VCs, don't take it, because it is, at a very, very high premium, that you do it. You're diluting your company, but, 2 or 3% or 5 or 10% of a really, really big number is much better than 100% of zero. And so that's really how you think about the sort of VC, equation.
Cool. So just to kind of reprise a few of the points, really we talk about this, by the way, at MIT Venture Mentoring Service. I don't know how many of you have signed up. Joe's probably mentioned it to you. It's one of the very first questions we ask founders who come through the program, and we revisit it often. How much runway do you have? Can you support yourself? Do you have a way to bear the expenses, lab expenses, prototyping, a team, any kind of analysis that you need to do, or any other expenses that you have to cover before you get to that magic revenue? What is that number? It's astonishing, not only in VMS, but in conversations with other founders I meet, certainly, I don't know about the rest of you, how often people either don't really have a good handle on that number, or they don't feel comfortable talking about it. So it's something you need to be really, really comfortable talking about. Like, this is what we need to get to profitability. And profitability, by the way, is the ultimate objective for most enterprises. We have had in the past, depending on how you count, 20 years, a parade of companies that have gone public, still not knowing how to make money. The market is less and less welcoming, frankly, to those models. And so I wouldn't encourage you to choose that as your objective. How do we think about, one of the things that I know I've spoken with each of you about, and that I spend a lot of time talking to founders about, is being super clear about what that objective looks like. What does success look like to you? Do you want to have an IPO? Do you want to have a business that stays private and is hugely profitable? Do you want to have an international expansion? Do you want to have an enterprise that has a hybrid approach that has both impact and profitability objectives? How do you encourage founders to think about those things at the beginning?
So at the beginning, I think very early stage, there are three things you have to think about, right? Your team, it's not just financials are very important, but your team, the market that you're going into, and your technology or product. I think everything that comes together revolves around these three, right? At the stage we look at, when companies come to us, right, they're very early, but we want to make sure that, the team may be small, maybe it's 2 founders, but they have some advisors that they have on board with them, helping them along, right, at that stage. In terms of the market, they've done the research that includes, they have a financial projection they've put together. Now we know when you're early, there's a lot of risk. Like that's why we invest at the seed stage, because it is very risky. So while your projections are not perfect, you have to have something that you come to with us that shows, okay, this is where you're at right now, and this is how you're going to get to where you need to. This is the capital you need at every stage. And it has to be believable with milestones that accompany every set of capital requirements. Because that way, that gives confidence. Okay, you've gotten this far. Okay, if I give you this money, whichever, whether it's like pre-seed or even seed, right? What's that going to take you? How far is that going to take you? Right? So that's the kind of, we want to see that use of funds as well. Obviously the technology is important. We know, you're still early, but you have to show a path forward where, you can get to launch, right? I mean, at some point, because of the funding that you're going to get at each stage, and you're going to hit these milestones to advance your technology. So these three things are fundamentally, I think, everything that that you put together for your startup needs to be centered around. That's how I see it. Steve.
So Julianne said, you got to think about what you want, and how big you want to grow your business. And I think that's really important, because there are fantastic, as you saw in that video, there's fantastically successful companies that came from someone's savings, right? And they end up, throwing $1 million in cash every year to the founders, and they never took a cent of outside capital.
Or
That's
a lot more.
Or what?
Or a lot more.
Well,
There are multi-billion-dollar companies
I
that
know
never
that
had.
no one in here has sales, so I was just trying to tamper it down.
Yeah.
I mean, would that be nice if you just had $1 million a year running your little side business? And, maybe that's the goal. The thing that I like to point out to, especially people, and I think the video does a good job of it, saying like venture capital sucks all the oxygen out of the room. No offense to my fellow panelists, but you have to ask the question, you're going to exit your company you're going to have to exit this company. You're going to have to sell it or IPO it. I mean, IPO would be great, but it's, a 20% chance of IPO and 80% chance of exiting on a success, right? The bulk of the investments that venture capitalists take are not successful. So, but you have to have an answer to that question, like, where do you want this to go? And if you're going to go down the path of venture capital or any kind of equity-based thing, you have to think about that exit. At least minimally internally think about that exit, because you're going to get asked that question, right? Like, okay, what if a strategic company comes up here and wants to buy you? Hopefully you're going to say yes, or you're going to engage in the due diligence. And that needs to be clear, from the beginning of when that happens. The other point I want to make is the bar of success. If you've raised 0 in capital and you get $1 in sales, that's fantastic, right? That's amazing. If you raise $1 million in venture capital and you get $1 in sales, that's terrible. We don't care about your $1. I mean, it's better than 0, but you've got $1 million in capital. The bar has gone up tremendously, because that has to be returned. The expectation is 3 to 5x of that $1 million. So, and that's just the investor portion of it too. So you have to think about how the expectation and how the goalpost moves once you raise that round of capital. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think what Julianne was talking about and Steve just alluded to is, what's your exit, strategy, or what's your exit plan? And, in the Majira project, we work with all the companies are growth companies, but, I think there is a difference between sort of, Wall Street and Main Street. So we're working with some companies that are more, I would say, mom and pop plus 1 or 2. So they're trying to grow. I would say it's beyond sort of a lifestyle company, but they are not going to be hockey stick exponential growth. And some of them don't actually want to exit. And so VC is not for them. That is just, and that's actually fine, you know, if that's the answer, but they're going to have to do that raising in a different way, where it's going to have to be revenue based. You know, people will get the money back. It's not going to be the same types of multiples, like Steve was saying. You know, people are going to want a whole bunch of money back, you know, because unfortunately, the way this works is almost a little bit like, you know, pharma. You got a big funnel, you get a lot of things in, but you're really betting on a few big home runs, you know, or like, you know, grand slams. Really in venture is what you're looking for. So you know that unfortunately, most of these companies aren't going to pan out. And so it is a bit of, you know, from a portfolio perspective, and it's hard to really call. You know, people can get a little bit better at it in doing so, but you know, really, you do need to know where you're going. You know, is it an IPO? Do you want to, you know, you think you're gonna merge with a big strategic? Like, it's good to have that plan, because then you can be really honest with your investors, and they actually understand your story better. You know, and they can see, you know, because a no, a fast no is great, you know, or it's a lot better than a slow no. You know, if somebody knows, you know, don't waste your time, you can move on to trying to get that yes as you're raising.
Awesome. So the only way to choose the right kinds of capital, and it is kinds, and we're going to talk a little bit more about later stages from the startup. The only way to choose the right kinds of capital is, again, first of all, to understand your needs, and also to match those against your ultimate objectives. I personally take a lot of odds with the prevalent language around startups and founders being like, you have to take this route, and only like the hugest quote unquote unicorns, megacorns, decacorns, whatever the hell we're dealing with right now, only those are the, you know, the important successes. The actual point of fact is that those companies do sometimes make fantastical fortunes, but I know, and you know, some enormously successful founders who came away from very big successes with not a whole lot to show for it, like some 10 or 12 years of experience. Because what happens when you have particularly layers of angel investor, and venture investment, is you own less and less, and not only that, but you have less and less say, right? So it's not only ownership in the company that you're paying with, you're also paying with your decision space, and your decision space gets narrower and narrower and narrower, right? So yes, if that's the role you want to take, you want to be a chimerical founder, awesome. But there is no hierarchical difference, frankly, between that and, as I mentioned, there are several founders I'm privileged to know who built their companies without outside investment, using grants and business loans and non-recurring engineering and customer prepayment and a whole bunch of other mechanisms, which I'd like for us to talk about, in order to grow billion or multi-billion-dollar companies, which they own outright, right? So even if you want to grow a huge company, you may not necessarily, based on the sector you're in, based on your needs for capital, based on your ultimate objectives, you may not really want or need venture capital. You may be very much better off with other forms of capital. So let's talk about what some of those are, if we could. So
I have a question here.
there's customer pre-purchase,
I have a question.
which we have now, like a whole bunch of platforms to provide that, but you can also pre-sell without even using a platform. There's non-recurring engineering, where you have a commercial customer who's paying you to do some of the development work, so you don't have to bear those costs. There's a variety of forms of finance available on a contract. So you get your first contract and hey, like, guess what? Banks are willing to lend to you all of a sudden, right? So how do you advise founders to think about these other forms of capital that may be helpful once you get off that first like pre-commercial, like just out of the gate, but you're not quite profitable, you're not quite there yet, but how do you think about those sort of intermediate sources? Go!
I'm ready to go. Okay, so, I grew up in the land before Kickstarter, and I know there's like, I use the phrase Kickstarter to be like the generic thing. But once you go through the entrepreneurial process and you realize, wow, customers buying my stuff is really the solution I've been looking for all along. And it's like I go and pitch these investors and they're always asking me about my customers. Why am I spending all my time with these investors? Why don't I spend my time? And then Kickstarter came around and I'm like, that's it. There's no more financing needed. Like, that's the way you should do it. So I guess I've often given that suggestion to people to get glassy eyes, kind of like I'm seeing in the audience here. But the point, I think there's a number of data points that show people, launching a Kickstarter campaign and creating some customer traction, some real commitments of real cash, and maybe it was unsuccessful, or maybe it was or not. But the point is, you put it out there and that becomes a due diligence point for an equity-based investment. So there are a lot of VCs that look at kind of that proof point in Kickstarter. So I'm so grateful that that thing exists now. I wish it was around, well, let's just say when I was an undergrad or first time entrepreneur.
Yeah. And
So if you're thinking about a product, right? This is not so great for a service. I have been seeing some interesting pre-purchases for service, but if you're launching a product, how do you think about doing pre-sales for a product?
So one thing we also see is we, ask companies to see if they can do pilots with some of their customers. In some cases, it might be unpaid, but in some cases, they can get paid pilots. And so I think that's a good source of revenue. And we also look at that as, have they gone and attempted to do that if they have a product? Because, or the other thing is also try and get into an accelerator. Like, for example, one of my startups was looking at skincare. So she got into the Sephora accelerator, which was a good way for her to get to know more about whether the business model she had was right or wrong. And, talking to somebody who actually can tell you whether, what you're doing is going to make sense or not, and get the right advisors from that process. So there's just so many different ways. There's not one right answer, but I think these are a few.
So the way I think about accelerators, and I think we all have slightly different ways of thinking about them, but the way I think about an accelerator is basically that is offsetting some of your cost, right? So as Priya just said, like, you get a bunch of free guidance, you get a bunch of connections to prospective customers, accelerated ahead of when you might be able to get them. So you're saving on time, you're saving on paying for services that are very valuable to you. I would not recommend joining an accelerator that can't tell you, here's the suite of services we provide, right? If they're like, oh, it's great name recognition and you have exposure, like, that's nonsense. Don't do that. So Kerry, tell us more about, like, how do we think about customer pre-purchase? How do we think about non-recurring engineering? How do we think about these other ways of financing development before we're ready to go fully to market?
Yeah, I think, going back to, any money that you can get, that is non-dilutive, that is from customers, do that. Pretty much you want to do anything that's going to make it easier for you. So, the cool thing with a Kickstarter is not only does it give you, money to, sort of develop products, because, oftentimes the cool thing about Kickstarters, and typically CPG or retail, like, Julianne said, a product, but you don't have to go ask somebody to do it. People pay you up front and then you can do it. Because oftentimes if you're going to run a small lot of something, the numbers are ridiculous. So you need the volume to be able to do it at scale. And so that's the beauty of Kickstarter is you can, get 1,000 folks. And then also for investors, they can go, oh, now you've got 1,000 people bought your product. That makes a lot more sense. Going back to, doing stuff with strategics or paid pilots. Not only is it giving you some money in there, but you've got a partner, you got a thought partner. A lot of big corporates, they're so big, they're stodgy. It's hard to get a big ship to turn fast. So, I mean, that's actually the R&D, mode for a lot of big corporates is they're, bringing in, smaller outfits to work with. And then, if it makes sense, they just absorb them. They pull them into the Borg and keep going. So it's sort of your exit strategy. When you talk about exit strategy, that might be exactly how you do it. You have those people there. So all of this is, I think someone talked before, you're sort of de-risking everything that you're doing. The more that you get through an accelerator or an incubator or, prepaid, whatever, it's all about de-risking. When you're talking about, especially other people's money, they want to understand that and they want to know that you have really a competitive advantage. And these are the different ways that you can do that.
Yeah, fantastic. And hearing directly from customers is way, way, way better than, paying for market research. And you get much, much better intel. So when we think about, we're going to stay at this stage for a moment. When we think about the other ways that we can bring in capital, one of the ways that's become available just in the last few years is equity crowdfunding, where you can go out to the public through Republic or one of the other platforms and recruit investors who are excited about what you are doing. And there you get to set the terms. We're raising X amount of dollars for this enterprise. These are the terms. What advice do you have for founders to think about the equity crowdfunding option?
You want me to go first on this? Uh-oh.
However you like, the three of you.
Yikes. So at the risk of being maybe not the most positive on equity.
Bring it on.
So I've been more on the investor side of equity crowdfunding, and I haven't made much of a return on the deals that I put in there. But I think, when you peel back the onion and look at kind of equity crowdfunding and how it's done, the terms are defined by the entrepreneur. So, a lot of times you look at a deal and you're like, okay, I get 10% of the entire investor base is going to get 10% of this very early stage company. That's super high risk. That's not really what market would be. So it's hard to kind of make an investment at that point. But as an entrepreneur raising capital, by all means, it sounds like a great deal. Stuff all these guys into the common share side of things and take the money and run. So, I mean, that's I guess maybe this is on Zoom? Is this being recorded?
So
My name is Kerry Bowie.
So Priya and Kerry, like from the founder's point of view, how would you think about equity crowdfunding? Like, what are the pros and cons, or where does it make a lot of sense for you to do that, and where does it maybe not?
Yeah, so I'll add a couple of things. I think one, we were talking before with Kickstarters and sort of the pre-purchase piece, really just more product CPG. Now with equity crowdfunding, you can get into service, based companies or, something that's, B2B or SaaS or different things, because now you're getting an equity stake. So that it does open it up for more companies to get in. I think the things that, and I'm probably a little more sort of neutral or agnostic than Steve is. That's Steve. I think there's this, piece from a con perspective that, there are people who are sort of concerned that you may be, diluting your cap table because you got all of this, these folk in here. What does that really look like? You know, others will say, well, it's aggregated in a big lump, and you know, maybe it's, you know, is it dumb money versus smart money? That's, you know, I think that's in the eye of the beholder and who you're talking about, because you know, sometimes you just want the money. And so I think it typically is better for, in my estimation, you know, either product or small, more Main Street, you know, where it's, you've got a model, you sort of know what you're doing, you really just need, you know, funding. And you also don't think you need a lot of people to help you or to sort of be in your mix, you know, doing things. I think for some other more technical things that are going to take off and you need some expertise and all of that, it's probably not as good a fit.
Yeah, I don't have anything much to add over that. I'm not a huge fan of of this, but I will just say that, you know, I advise people to go and look at federal and state money. There's plenty out there. That's what I tell my companies, my startups, get the money. People have raised 12, 13, 14, 15 million just through these sources. And they come to us when they're just ready to scale, right? That's the right time. Don't come to VCs. That's what I would say.
Yeah. One other thing I will add from an inclusion perspective, I think the one thing that equity crowdfunding has done, and maybe not just equity crowdfunding, I think about the Jobs Act that came out. You know, one of the issues has been, you know, getting into sort of angel or investing is sort of almost a protected class where, you know, if you're not an accredited investor, you can't play. So a lot of people have been locked out because of that. I think what equity crowdfunding has done is allowed a lot of other people to get in by sort of, you know, lowering the bar in terms of the amount of money. And it's, you know, it's sort of, you know, it's letting people play. But I think the concern is, you know, maybe to what Steve is saying, you can only play in this certain space because some of the things that are going to have the bigger returns, they're not going there. You know, the folk who are at the big VC firms, you typically, I'm not going to say that the two groups are mutually exclusive, but it's really, really teeny, the overlap that you're going to see.
So I think if you guys are all pre-revenue and you're still developing your product, you think about the firm in terms of kind of building credibility, and you individually have credibility, but you saying I'm great is kind of, you know, sort of, it's okay, but it's better if somebody else says I'm great, right? So the more people you can get around to sort of validate your business and validate the company, the better. And that comes in the form of, you know, incubator associations or, you know, successful crowdfunding events or Kickstarter events. So if you just look at it from that perspective and not say like, I have to raise all my money in this crowdfunding campaign. If you're just doing it and you get some people that have credibility to kind of lend to you, that's an important sort of additive piece. So that, you know, and if you go and if you get SBIR funding or state funding, all of this thing just goes to sort of add to the overall like network of people that support your business, right? It's not just me anymore. It's me plus all these people that have said, this is good stuff, you should take a look at it. Having said all that, the fact that people on Kickstarter give you money for your product 2 years before they actually take receipt of it is a fantastic, that's the data point that I'm looking for. So
Yeah,
I'll stop pumping it. I'm not an investor in Kickstarter, so.
or any of the other platforms. So in this very early stage, and we're going to move on to mid and late stage in just a second. In this very early stage, there are lots of options with lots of pros and cons for each. They're fit for different kinds of uses, different kinds of capital needs, different kinds of objectives, right? You probably want to have a mix, not just rely on one. One of the ones we haven't touched on that people use a lot is friends and family, right? So really, really briefly, without getting down into the real horror of how that can go, friends and family is fantastic if you have wealthy people who are near to you and who are more than happy to trust you with some money without being sure they're ever going to see it again, right? The downside I've seen to that is a lot of people fail to formalize that agreement as an investment. So it's like a handshake. You know, dear Aunt Evelyn gives you, you know, $50,000, God bless her, right? Then every single family holiday after that, she's like, hey, what you doing with my money? Right? And then God forbid you have to go back to her and say, oh, dear Aunt Evelyn, that money's gone and we're trying to get some more money because we still have some things we need to do that we need money for. And suddenly your dear Aunt Evelyn is more like cranky Aunt Evelyn and your relationship has soured, right? What are some of the other pros and cons to friends and family that we should think about?
I'll go again from an inclusion perspective. The big con is, and you can probably see I'm a African American or Black man. If we look in sort of the venture world, the numbers are just wow. You know, it's I think 3 to 4%. You know, of VC was going to women. You know, a couple of years ago, I think it's like 2%. Like 1% goes to African Americans. So if you're a African American woman, it's like 0.001%. So not
I think
getting
you left off as 0, actually.
yeah, maybe it's 0.001. It's low. It's fractional. And so that's bad. But now you go, well, can't they tap their friends and family? But part of what pulled me out, I used to work, you know, I didn't share this, but coming out of MIT, I worked at Texas Instruments, and then I went to the University of Michigan, and I came back up here. And when I went to Sloan, I worked for Governor Patrick and Governor Baker. And part of what made me jump back into the private sector is back in 2014, the Federal Reserve Bank did a Color of Wealth report. And the two big stats that jump out for me still now is the average net worth of a white family in Boston was $247,500. The average net worth of a Black family was $8. So if you think of friends and family, if you think of sort of, you know, 10% of your disposable cash flow, you can maybe do for something like angel investing or something. That means that a white family can write a $25,000 check and a Black family can write a 80-cent check. So I think there's a gap there. And so that's my only concern with friends and family is there's a lot of people who they can't tap their friends and family because they don't have any money. And I feel like we're losing out as a economy and as a nation because a lot of people go, that's the way you go. And if there's a big roadblock there, it doesn't work. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do. It's in the pattern matching space. Can we get some more emerging fund managers and others? Because for me, from what I see, you know, it's almost like an arbitrage opportunity because the folk who are there who made it a little bit, I would say they're better because they've done more with less. And so I think I think a lot of people think they're risky and you know, risky bets. I'm going, no, this is where I want to put my money because this is, you know, they've got that grit and the moxie, and they've, you know, their sort of road traveled has been longer and harder and more tenuous. So that's the only thing I'll say about sort of Brendan.
That's great, because you're actually giving us a great segue into the next, which is, so if you're in that very, very early pre-launch stage, there's a wide range of capital options with various pros and cons. And once you sort of get to the next stage where maybe you have secured state or federal grants, you have SBIR, you have IRA or GGRF or one of the other programs, or you have state level grants, right? And ideally you have some customer traction. And what we mean by traction is willingness to pay, by the way. Traction just means actually giving you money. So maybe you have some customer traction, you have some great grant dollars that have gotten you to the point where you're really, really ready to launch and grow properly. Then there are the really big questions about like, do we take dilutive funding? Do we take bank loans? Do we take other forms of contract finance or other kinds of loan structures as opposed to equity capital? So what are the questions founders should be thinking about when they're at that stage? What are the trade-offs? What are the pros and cons that people in the room should be weighing?
Okay, I'm glad I didn't have to answer the family and friends questions. Thank you, Kerry.
No
That was, it's a, Steve over there. That was a great answer, by the way. So in terms of like, if you're post SBR, you've got customer traction and you want to, and now the decision is, where do we go from here? Now you have a real decision about like how fast we want to grow and what source of capital do I want to use to grow the enterprise. You know, I'm assuming, you know, that if you have some grant funding, you have a prototype built and you have a good idea of what the customers want, and maybe you've sold some early prototypes or you've got some NRE funding in to kind of help you develop it.
Non-recurring engineering, NRE.
The rocket scientist speaks. And now you're faced with kind of growth and you have this ability to raise, at that point, you have a much better story and you have some traction for the customer. And now it's a question of, do I want to put my, you know, light some fuel under this fire and really ramp it up and, you know, really, that's when the race happens in the video that we saw at the beginning. And at that point, the questions become, what is it that I need to spend my money on? Do I need to spend it on sales and distribution channels? Do I need to spend it on a manufacturing center? Probably some combination of the two. I always recommend that any assets in manufacturing you try and do with debt as much as possible, but usually debt at that stage needs to come with some equity associated with it. So I guess there's a much longer answer, but the shorter answer is you look at your growth trajectory and you say, man, this is going to really grow really fast. I need to get fast capital. I need to get equity-based financing for this, and it's going to cost me a lot. But the upside is so huge that I'll be able to kind of pay that back. Well, I mentioned earlier about, you know, raising expectations and the reason why sort of the race is really important for VCs. I like to kind of use my hands for this, but if you raise $1 million and eventually you're going to return $10 million, if it takes a long time for you to return that $10 million, the slope of the curve is the IRR. So if it takes you, you know, 10, 15 years to return $10 million, you think this is fantastic. I've made you money, but you know, the VCs who, by the way, have to get their money from limited partners. So they are the ones that are sort of in obligation to kind of post big high returns. They're going to be disappointed with that. Now, if you can return $10 million in a year, that's miraculous, right? That slope of that curve is tremendous. So you've got a much more salivating investor base if that's the kind of business that you can operate. So as we talk through this, you can kind of see how, you know, moving the financing for equity financing further and further along until you've got a really good prototype and really, you know, excellent customer references that really want to buy from you and you're ready to kind of turn it on. And frankly, if you turn this around, sometimes you may have investor conversations and they say, that's great, keep in touch, keep in touch. What they want to hear is, when are you at that inflection point, right? And of course, all of your charts are going to show, we're at that inflection point right now, write a check right now. But, you know, the reality is that's really what we're describing. So as soon as you hit that, that's when they want to write the check, because then they know they're the highest chance of a really solid IRR coming in. So
Let me just interrupt before the rest. So does everybody know how venture funds actually work? The funds themselves? Some? Okay, so
You
just
didn't do your homework the rest of you.
really quickly, the reason why the time scale matters very much to venture funds is because a typical venture fund life is 10 years. So in the first 3 or 4 years, they're making investments, and in the remaining 6 or 7 years, they're harvesting. That means that they are trying to demonstrate returns in that span of time. So let's say in Steve's example, you get $1 million check and it's year 3 of the fund. They're going to be pressing you very, very hard for an exit within 3 or 4 years of making that investment, because they're not going to wait till they get to that 10-year mark to try to get their money back. right? So that's why having that timeline in mind is really, really important. Do I want this money on this time frame with the expectation that we're going to be looking, all of us are going to be looking for an exit in 3 to 4 years, right? Sorry to interrupt, Priya.
No, I just wanted to add that in our case, we have an evergreen fund. So what that means is essentially, we don't get money from anywhere. We just keep making smart investments and getting, good returns, good exits. So we don't necessarily have a time frame. I agree with what Julianne said. That's how we look at companies when they come to us, that do we see that happening over the next few years? So it's not like it's open season. Okay, you can take as long as you want. But what I agree with everything you said, right? I mean, you've got to, and what actually Steve said, when, I have a company that came out of a university, got real and very quickly managed to get pilots, very quickly managed to get paid pilots, and then, came to us saying that, hey, I want to raise a round because I want to scale. And he raised money, right? 2 million, not a whole lot. And he had a lot of customer traction, hit 1 million in revenue, annual revenue. And so he doesn't need to raise more money from us, say, for example. He could continue, making customer traction slowly, and it'll take him a lot longer to get to where he can really, have a 10 million annual revenue or something like that. But that was the decision he faced. Should I raise more money so I can scale? I can make payroll. I don't have a problem. I can pay the people I have. It's just going to take longer. So that's why he decided, okay, now I'm going to raise a Series A or something like that. So you got to think through that, just like what Steve gave an example at every point. Can I continue? Can I continue to, because sales, marketing, one person can do it all. The market may be big, but you may need to add a few people. So you need to get money for that. So look at what's the best source and go for it. That's how I would say.
Maybe just add 3 things. One, going back really quickly, I just want to, we talked about Kickstarter and a bunch of different platforms. I did want to sort of plug my friend Mike Norman. He launched WeFunder is one of those platforms. And Mike actually was at Sloan a couple of years behind me. He did the Kennedy School, and he actually wrote a lot of the Jobs Act. And then from coming out of that, he ended up starting WeFunder, one of those platforms. So I wanted to give a nod to him that, a lot of this stuff has just happened in the last, 10, 15, 20 years. So a lot of these things are relatively new. I think one of the things, and I think we talked about it, we just wanted to share a little bit, as you're getting the money to be in the race and getting the gasoline poured on, those investors that are coming in, is not just money. They do want, they're getting ownership, but they're getting some control and some governance too. So I think that's the one thing to be, sort of not necessarily leery or weary of, just know that comes with it, and so I've seen it in a number of different cases. Sometimes you as a founder, you need to be able to understand as you're working with the board and different, okay, like when is it time for you, you're out above your, beyond your skis or whatnot, and somebody else's time to come in, but sometimes you might do that a little bit too early. And I've seen that in a number of cases. I remember, Robin, from Zipcar, Robin Chase came in. She left a little bit too early, but she was feeling like maybe I don't, have this, but, she finally was like, brought somebody in, but then came back in herself because she was like, this is really my thing and I need to do it. I know I was just at Black Tech weekend in Detroit, and I was in Cincinnati for Black Tech Week a couple of weeks ago. The guy who runs that is Brian Bracken. I met him, Bracken, down in Miami. He had a company, Kairos. As you're in the elevators and you're looking at the ads, there are things that are looking at your eyeballs and seeing if you're reading. That company was doing well, and they were like, hey, we need somebody else. They jettisoned him. He was no longer the the founder. He ended up coming back a few years later, but you see that, Steve Jobs, you just think about, well, and we're happy because we got Pixar, out of that, but people can go, it's not you, and this is your baby. And so you got to be ready for that. because this is about that race. And sometimes you need to bring in another COO or a CEO or somebody who's run something really big, because when you started it, it wasn't really big. And there are different people who are sometimes geared for different things. And sometimes, no, it's you grow with it. You think about a Facebook or something like that. You might just continue to grow and just bring in the people around you. Maybe that wasn't the best example, but thinking things like that.
Cool. So just sort of putting tying a bow on that comment that you just offered, Kerry. Have you heard the expression people use often that taking a venture investment is like a marriage? Have you heard that expression? It's very, very commonly circulated. Here's how that is true. It's true in that it is a legally binding relationship and it's very intimate. And you are giving up a lot of control over your life. So, somebody's in your underwear drawer on a routine basis, right?
Can I add to that?
Just a second.
Okay.
Here's how it's not like a marriage. Here in the United States, at least, and in lots of other countries, if you have an unhappy marriage, then it's painful and expensive and hugely disruptive to your life. But God forbid you reach that point, you can divorce. You cannot divorce your investors, but they can, and very often do, remove founders with or without cause. And the without cause is particularly painful, right? Like, we just want to bring in somebody we feel better about. And that does happen. So you should just be aware of that. When we're thinking about the pros and cons of different kinds of capital, each of those different kinds of capital, again, is ideally suited to different uses. It has different time scales. It has different costs, right? But also when you're talking about particularly a bank relationship or a venture relationship, you really want to audition that person very diligently, right? How do I feel about working with this person? The firm, the bank, the venture firm, Mass Ventures, other, quasi-government entities, whatever. I need to feel good about the firm, but I also need to feel that I have alignment with this person and I believe them, that's a little bit beyond like technical testing and financial analysis. That really gets down to like, do I trust this person to have the same objectives, the same vision of success I do, and to work on that with me, right? If you're just approaching dollars like a dollar's a dollar, and I've heard that advice given, which is terrible advice. I've also heard advice given, just get the money and figure it out later. Deadly advice. That ends in tears. Routinely, it ends in tears. And by the way, not for the people who wrote the check. It ends in tears for the founder. So when you're thinking about all these different forms of capital, you really, really, really want to think about, what are my needs? What are my objectives? What does it take in the sector I'm in to achieve my definition of success? And there are lots of comparables you can look at. Who are the resources, not just what are the resources, but who are the resources who are likely to be helpful to me to that end? Long-term, short-term, tactically, right? Again, if you are an MIT person, VMS. I-Corps. If you're a Massachusetts resident, Mass Ventures. Take advantage of the resources that are available to you. And Steve, SBIR and other federal programs. Take advantage of the resources that are available to you, but choose eyes open, make informed choices about what is actually in your interest. A dollar, I promise you, is truly not a dollar. Okay, you had a final comment, and then we want to give them at least a couple minutes for questions.
Okay. I'm going to skip the comment because you answered it beautifully. but I do want to make a, what was the last point you just made? I'm
A
having
dollar is not a dollar.
No, something else. Never mind.
All right. Questions for this illustrious panel, please.
And use the mic for the Zoomers.
For the Zoomers.
I just have a couple of statements really to kind of share upon what you've stated earlier. You mentioned the exit strategy. You really want to make sure you emphasize that. And I can speak from experience. I lost a $300,000 investor because my exit strategy wasn't clearly mapped out. So yes, right on the money. Then somewhat you also discussed about your consumer selling your goods without having to go borrow money, increase your revenue. I have another company, and that's exactly what we did. We started off, I think, our first year, $500,000. Last year, we closed at $1.3 million. This year, we should close around $4 million with about $10 million on our books. And again, we did that without borrowing any money. You know, a little line of credit, but you can. Total Direct Care, another story. We're going to reach out to some funds.
Awesome. Down front, please.
Thank you. I have a question about VC. So it's maybe it was mostly for Priya, but for everybody. We have a very expensive proof of concept, which was proven in academia. And what we hear from investors that, well, come back later to us when they have a proof of concept, but we cannot get a proof of concept until we get money. So question for you guys, should we keep trying? We also applied for the grant, CBR. We also applied for NIH. So should we wait for the undiluted funds, do proof of concept that takes very long time, or should we keep trying, angels and VCs?
I'll just give a really short answer and then I'd love for you to elaborate. The really important thing for you to understand as a founder in this particular enterprise, and for all of you with your own particular enterprises, is where are the sources of support for your particular enterprise? So there are, for example, what sector are you in? Biotech. She's in biotech. So there are sources of capital very, very interested in early stage development or proof of concept stage development of technologies, products, solutions that meet their objectives. So for example, there are foundations, there are family offices, there are quasi-governmental entities. There's a bunch of organizations specifically focused on that gap, right? You've exhausted your original academic support. You're not yet ready, frankly, for equity investors. What do you do in between? So it's, again, your privilege and your burden as founder to acquaint yourself with who are those entities who want to fund that gap, right? Some great ways to learn that are institutional, professional and institutional organizations, industry organizations in your specific sleeve of biotech. Again, VMS, fantastic source of information. You're in biotech, so Priya probably has some fantastic resources for you, but you need to sort of uncover who are the entities who are really focused on what you are doing. The spray and pray approach is, again, one of the worst pieces of advice I've heard people given, and it's given all the time. Do not do that. It's a total waste of your time. Focus on people who care about what you are trying to solve.
I want to jump in here before Priya, but I mentioned I teach the SBIR course, and one of the challenges with a lot of the grant funding that we're talking about is that there's a calendar for, when do you apply and when is your application due, and it never matches what you need, right, as an entrepreneur, but it is a process that you go through. I see that as a gift. There's a date when you submit it, and then there's nothing you can do after that. So what I recommend everybody do is go ahead and figure out the right grants to apply for. And then once you press submit, any futzing around is usually a negative. They usually say like, hey, why are you, you can't mess with the review process now. It's time for you to step back. That's a great time to step back and continue the conversation with angels and VCs, because typically, if you find somebody and they're like, I'm in this space, I understand what you're doing, but man, you're way too early. They do want to keep in touch. And I know that is a trite statement. It's like, hey, that's a great pitch. Let's keep in touch, which really means go away. I don't really want to hear from you anymore. Oftentimes it actually means the opposite. And I can't tell you which one the difference is. You're going to have to ask maybe one of those Harvard guys that has more social skills than I do. So
Let me add one thing, just on the SBIR piece. The I-Corps program, just, we talked about de-risking. The whole purpose of the I-Corps program is to de-risk the money that NSF is spending on SBIR. And so what it is something's coming out of a lab, sort of been proven in academia. The whole I-Corps thing is customer discovery to go, does anybody care? Does anybody really want this technology? So I would say if you haven't done it, go through the I-Corps program, not for NSF, but for NIH. I think NIH has a similar program. At least at NSF, they pay you $50,000 to do it, to go and just talk to people and learn about it. So I would do that because that just helps you to prove out and to see where you are and to, sort of on the government's dime to, get better product market fit and go to market strategy and figure things out. I would definitely do that if you haven't done it.
Yeah, I think what they said, right, and what Julianne said, I don't have anything more. I don't want to just say I agree, but I will just say that if you go to investors, go to the right ones, that, you have to do your research to make sure that, that even in angel groups, you may not find the right angels. If you go to any angel group, they may not be the right investors for you, right? They may not understand what you're doing. So maybe mass medical angels, for example, might be the right fit if you're in that space. So even in terms of investors as a whole, go to a biotech investor, go to the Mass Life Sciences Center, right? They have grants that, you can take advantage of and you can advance your technology, right? So look at all those sources, but go to the right people, right? After SBIR, of course.
do you need for your personal counsel?
How much do you need? The question?
That's
600,000?
100,000.
Is that what you said?
300,000 or 6? 300,000.
Well, and I still, the cool thing I like about I-Corps is I actually don't want you doing your proof of concept until you talk to a lot of people, because what you want might not be what your customers want. And so I want to make sure you don't rush to an MVP or prototype that now you just wasted a bunch of time doing something because you bring it out and somebody's like, I don't like that. That needs to be here. I want you to figure that out before you spend even $600,000. I want you to figure that out first.
So one last thing I would add to that is that those of you who are here at MIT and those of you who are guests, both, you have the entrepreneurial peer community also as your network. So ask your peers, ask other founders who are anywhere between 6 and 36 months ahead of you, who's funding them and what is that experience like? And ask it in a very open-ended way. Don't say like, is it good? But ask them like, what's that experience like? So, your peers, particularly the ones who are a step or a couple of steps ahead of you, are an inestimably valuable intelligence source, right? And also they are your network for support. So the other thing I'll just say in conclusion is that being the founder or even being part of a founding team is enormously exciting and gratifying. And we keep hanging around this community and founding things and funding things, working with things. It's also, when I say that you have the privilege and the burden, you really do. It's down to you, right? So talk to people who know that experience, who share that experience, and particularly who have just a little bit of lead on you in a very similar enterprise, right? That intelligence is better than you're going to get from, people with big titles and big names and, brand stamp venture firms. Like that intelligence is the most valuable you can get. Thank you all very much.
Okay. And I should just mention, we hadn't talked about venture mentoring service, really. So
Only a half dozen times, but,
no, I don't know.
oh, you haven't.
You are a member of the MIT community, student, faculty, staff, alumni in the Boston area. You can apply to a venture mentoring service, VMS, and they'll provide an intake team. They'll work with you. They give you homework. And once you're in there, there's also a network of entrepreneurs. They communicate with each other. So that would be one way to figure out who's getting funded in your area. So I think it's vms.mit.edu.
And it's free.
And it's free and they
for
don't
as
take
long as
equity.
You want it.
Yeah. It's
V like Victor.
VMS. Yeah, Victor, Mary, Sam. Yeah, .mit.edu. So I think that's it. Okay, well, we'll do it. Thank you very much to our panel. Fantastic.
Good luck, everyone.
And we'll take about a 10-minute break and then we'll return with financial projections.